Wednesday episode of the Donovan Bandits. I'm Oren Phillips, and we have a big one today. This is someone we've been going after for a while. I think since day one, and we finally have him. It's about Art Thibert. Art has been a part of Image, Marvel, so many other wonderful projects. I remember us, collecting as teenagers. His name was all over everything. So if it was something cool, Art was a part of it. Very honest guy. He's a straight shooter. Talks about his career, some of the projects he's worked on. And I think you're really going to enjoy this interview. I know I did. So enough of me. Here's Art, Mr. Art Thibert. Art, thank you so much for taking the time.
Hey, no problem. And I'm sorry it took so long. We're playing phone tag for forever, and then I had to reschedule, and so here we are now. So that's good.
We're happy to have you. And the first question, as we ask everybody, is how did you first discover comics?
How did I first discover comics? Um, Really, really young. I just kind of walking around supermarkets, places like that, five and dimes. They call them five and dimes
Mhm.
when I was a kid, like thrifties type places, save-ons, that type of. And so there were some comic books on a rack, and I think I recognized Batman because of the '66 TV series. So I was probably around 5 years old, which was a pretty good age for that. And so I saw these comic books, and they had Batman on them, and I asked my mom, and she said, "If you're good, maybe you'll get one of these books." And so apparently I was good because I got one of those books, and I still have that Batman to this day.
So yeah, I was just asking, at what point did you decide that you want to pursue a career in the comic field?
Um, it was later in life.
Mhm.
So when I was a kid, I drew all the time. So I drew from comic books and cartoons. I was a big cartoon kid, Hanna-Barbera and the Disney stuff. And so I think I liked that stuff more, when I was younger. But I drew like superhero stuff as well. And then when I got probably around, I don't know, 9, 10, 11, 12, around there, I started making my own comic books, drawing my own comic books and stuff like that. And of course, I thought I was like create my own characters, but they were just derivatives of, the ones that already existed. And but I never really consciously thought like, oh, I would love to do this for a living. I
Mhm.
didn't even really know if you could. You know what I mean? Like it was one of those things as a kid. I didn't even dawn on me. But there was the wonderful world of Disney. There was the Walt Disney stuff, right? He would go out, in the '60s, and he would say, "Here's an Imagineer. This guy created this, or this guy drew this." And so I started seeing that, and then he's like, "I run a studio, but there's artists." So it's the first time I really saw like people doing things. You know what I mean? Like artists drawing and so I was thinking, well, maybe I would want to do that. So, but it was a brief moment in time. I actually did write a letter. I sent, and they were all originals. When you're a kid, you don't make copies. And to be honest, I mean, we probably had just that bad Xerox
Right.
technology. They were kind of like mimeograph. They smelled weird. And so yeah, I sent those out, and they were all fully drawn, rendered, and Crayola colored. So they were yeah, there was some wax coloring on those bad boys, and I sent those out, and I think I still have the rejection letter, but it was very, very sweet. It was very, very kind. And it was just kind of like, not looking for anybody right now. I mean, they could obviously tell I was a kid.
Right.
And they said, keep working and maybe someday kind of thing. And so, I did that, and they sent me some kind of like, I don't know, it was some kind of like Disneyland like book. It had photographs and stuff, and it was really cool.
Yeah.
And I think that God, I'm trying to remember now. I think Mary Poppins must have just come out or around that time, because I got a ton of like Mary Poppins promotional stuff. Like there were like little mini posters and stuff like that. And so they never missed an opportunity to promote. And like I said, I still think I have that stuff somewhere. But then just left my brain, just as kids go on to something else. And so when I got into my teen years, I really just kind of drew sporadically. I was kind of getting out of music and cars and girls and just stuff like that, sports. And so I kept drawing, but not really ever thinking anything. And then what happened is, like, I'll just smash cut forward, is I had an epiphany, but it was kind of like a bad thing, like it was almost like divine intervention. So I had a major injury, and then I had a major surgery on my back. And so these were within like a year of each other. So there was like 3 years or so that I was bedridden, and so I really couldn't do anything. And so my girlfriend at the time brought me some comics, just because you're just bored, right? All you can do is sit and read and watch TV and stuff like that. So she brought me a bunch of comic books, a sketchbook, and some drawing tools and things like that. And so I found myself just kind of drawing from these comics and just kind of being entertained by it. And the stuff that was coming, like that she was picking up, was like the Pacific comic stuff, like indie stuff, and Savage Sword of Conan, like the magazine stuff. And so this was definitely more adult oriented. And so it really appealed to me because the art was on a different level. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't just like superhero. There's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, this was more illustrative. I mean, this was next level stuff. John Buscema and Dave Stevens on Rocketeer, and I think Neil Adams was working for Pacific, and Jack Kirby and Bernie Wrightson, like all like the heavy hitters. And so I mended, I kind of developed my chops in that time. And so then I was told by the doctor that you really might want to rethink your life, because you're not going to be able to lift anything. Because I was thinking I was just going to be just a manual laborer or something. Like I never had any real kind of, grandiose dreams or anything. And so when he said that to me, I go, what do you mean? He goes, well, you're not going to be able to be kind of a 9-to-5 guy. And so I was like, okay. And so then I started thinking, well, maybe I should devote more time to this, because I can be stationary, I can sit, I can, and that time I had a back brace on, and my neck was all in a brace and everything. So I'm still like a year into it, after the surgeries and stuff, still, pretty much, in this body cast kind of thing. And so I started just kind of going to conventions, talking to people. There was these creation conventions. I think they were called Creation, and this was probably 70s. And they had these contests, like art contests, right? So I was like, oh man. And then the prizes were always like, you'd get a print from like Boris Vallejo or something like that. Like whoever was at the show, you got something and it would be signed, right? So I started doing those, entering like some of my artwork. And I wasn't just like drawing like superhero stuff and things. I was like more illustration. So I was, like I said, music background. So I was like album cover artwork, stuff like that, Drew Struzan, these type of things. And so I always won, not to stroke my self too much, but I these contests. And so then it kind of fed my ego a little bit. So I started thinking like, well, maybe there's something to this, right? And so I met through school. I was going to junior college, and there was a teacher, and I was in illustration, and he said, everything you draw is heightened. Like you don't just draw what you see, you make it look better. And he goes, it reminds me of kind of like comic book artwork. He goes, are you into comic book artwork? And I said, yeah, I like comic book artwork. And he goes, well, I know a guy that works in the comic book industry. His name's Brian Murray. He said, I'll get you guys together. And so Brian Murray was working for, what was Neil Adams' Continuity? Was that his studio? Yeah. and he was working there, and I think he was doing megalith. Was that like that big strong guy in the blue suit? Yeah, yeah. He was drawing that book, and so Neil Adams was a hero of mine. So I was like, yeah, this is cool. And so I just kind of hung out with him, and he lived in Orange County, and so he knew Jim Valentino, and Jim Valentino also lived in Orange County. So and we kind of partied. We we kind of smoked and stuff. And so we all three of us got along pretty well. And Jim needed some help. I think a normal man. He was working on, these were like indie books. And so I helped him out. And then he got a job at Apple Comics. And have you ever heard of Apple?
No, that one I have. A Pacific, I know. Apple, I don't.
Okay, Apple was Richard and Wendy Penny's company, and they're the ElfQuest people.
Yep.
And so they were doing other books. I think they did Distant Soil, which was Colleen Duran's book. And then they did a book, they were adapting the Robert Asprin novels, Myth Adventures. And so that's the book we were doing. And so Jim got hired to do pencils, and I got hired to do inks. So that was kind of my first real professional work, is inking over Jim on Myth Adventures. And like I said, I was never like all that ambitious. You know what I mean? Like it just kind of like things just kind of fell into place. But I knew I had to pay rent. And so also around that time, I started getting work as an illustrator. So I would drive up to LA, and I would, show my portfolio and get jobs, go back to studio, work on them, things like that. I worked for, it was called Bridge Publications, and they did the, oh my gosh, what was his name? The guy that did Battlefield Earth. Yeah, Scientology.
Yeah.
Whoever's listening is going, you idiot! How can you forget that guy's name? The cult leader. And I can. Oh, go ahead.
I'm trying to think. Oh, I gotta look it up. But go on.
I can remember everything, like Dianetics, L. Ron Hubbard. That was it. Yeah, L. Ron Hubbard. And so they were great to me. The checks always came in on time. They paid me very, very well. And so I did illustrations for them. So I did like sci-fi illustrations, covers, things like that for them. And so then I was working with Jim Valentino at the same time. So, I'm on my own now. I got my apartment. I'm still in like a body. It was just like a support thing I could take on and off. So I was kind of getting weaned off like the casts and stuff like that. But I was still very, like, I couldn't really move too well. And so, yeah, it just kind of fell into place. I needed to pay the rent. So the artwork was starting to pay the rent. So just out of necessity, I was like, I can get paid to draw, so it was pretty cool. Yeah.
But it's interesting because, you did the inking and you also did the illustrating. Which one was more near and dear to your heart? Because I know you're known a lot for your inking, but your illustrations are also phenomenal as well.
Yeah. So, just to go back a little bit. So I'm working with Jim, but then like most indie, the money isn't either consistent or sometimes non-existent. So the money was kind of drying up. We get paid our first half, but we wouldn't get paid the second half of our money. So Jim was he had a family, so he's getting really frustrated. I'm getting frustrated because I got, rent and stuff like that. And so I just started talking to people, and they were like, well, Marvel and DC, they don't have these problems. They pay, and they pay on time. And I was like, oh, okay, just a naive, oh yeah, Marvel DC, yeah, I could do that. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't like it was just like, oh well, they pay on time, so that's what I'm gonna do, right? It was like I said, there was never any like grand plan. It was always just kind of like, just do it, get paid, and then go on to your next job. And so I was at one of these conventions, and I met Jim Shooter. And so Jim Shooter was looking at my work, and he was like, this is really good. He said, but you know, there's some areas and stuff like that, and you're not quite there. He said, I have like a bullpen at Marvel. And it's called the Romita Raiders, and you could work under, you know, Johnny Romita Sr. in there, and you could work on and you build your chops and then get work. I'm a California guy at that moment in time, right? Marvel Comics is New York. If you don't know, Jim Shooter's was editor in chief at Marvel Comics at the time, and so I'm like, okay. So he said, you know, just look me up when, you know, if you're ever in New York. So I don't know protocol. I don't know anything. I'm just a stupid kid, right? So I saved up some money. I made enough money to fly to New York City. I flew to New York City. I knew a guy from Jim Valentino. His name was Craig Anderson, and his dad was the Marmaduke artist, the comic strip guy. I forget, it was something Anderson. I don't remember his first name. But anyway, he also said something like, if you're ever in New York, you got a place to stay, right? So I didn't really call in advance to Marvel. I didn't call in advance to Craig Anderson. I just kind of got on the plane and showed up, right? So I took a I walked to Craig Anderson lived in Hell's Kitchen, like 42nd Street.
Okay.
And so I walked right up to the doorstep. I knock on the door. It's early. He's obviously at work already. So I'm like, okay. So I just kind of hung out till he got home. So then he's like, Art, what the hell? You know, I got my little suitcase and stuff, and you know, and I go, well, you said, you know, if I'm ever in New York. He goes, yeah, but you know, you should have called or something. And so, anyways, you know, I stayed there, and then the next day he went into work, and so we didn't go together though. And so then I went later, and so I went down to Marvel to, you know, get this apprentice job, whatever, right? And so I go in. There's the woman that's working, you know, the bottom floor, and she said, "Who are you here for?" I said, "Jim Shooter, Marvel Comics." And then she goes, "Well, I don't see your name here." So I was like, "Oh, okay." But somehow she let me up. Right. So then there's another type situation right outside of the Marvel offices. So I can see the Marvel door right there. And so there's a lady, and she says basically the same thing. So then I go, well, I'm here to see Jim Shooter, like not thinking like, come on, he's the big honcho, right? It's like, you know, I'm here to see whoever, you know, is in charge. And so then she goes, well, okay. So I got beeped in. And so I found out where Jim Shooter's office was. So I went in there, and he had a secretary as well. And so I'm talking to her, and then she goes, well, I don't see you have an appointment. I go, I didn't. He said this at this convention, blah, blah, blah. So I told her my story, and then she goes, okay, I'll be right back. So she goes in, she talks to him, she comes out, and she goes, he doesn't remember talking to you. And he doesn't have anything for you. And I was like, I came all the way from California. Like I'm like destroyed. I'm going, I flew all the way from California to save my money, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, oh, this guy's so stupid. And so she goes in and she talks to Jim, and then she comes out and she thinks she's got something for me, right? She goes, okay, how do you feel about working as an intern? And I go, I'll do it. And I go, how much does it pay? And she goes, internships don't pay. And I go, why would I do it? Right. Like, I actually said that, like, well, why would I do that? And then she goes, well, I don't know. This is all we got. You know what I mean? Like, beggars can't be choosers. So then I'm like, oh, crap. So then I go and I talked to Craig Anderson, who was Ralph Macchio's assistant at the time, assistant editor. And so he goes, well, somehow you got into Marvel. You're in the office. He goes, stop crying. I wasn't crying, but I was close to it. And he goes, you know, just dust yourself off. All the editors are here. Just knock on the door, be very polite, and show them your work. Maybe you'll get something. And so I did. I got turned down by every editor, you know, knock, knock, you know, Art Thibert, blah, blah, blah. I don't have anything for you right now. Okay, so I'm just getting ready to leave, just destroyed, right? Just distraught. And there was a guy who used to hang out at these creation Comic Cons. And so there were four guys. There was me, Rob Liefeld, Art Adams, and Art Nichols. So Art Nichols and Art Adams were Northern California. Rob and I were Southern California. So we do these kind of creation California shows. And so we kind of crossed over a little bit, but I really got to know Art at those cons. And so he's there. He's just right there. He's leaving as well. And he goes, Art. And I'm Art. And so it's like, what are you doing here? And he goes, I'm working at Marvel and DC now. I got work, because like sometimes people just disappear from your life. And so I told him my little backstory. He goes, hey, you know what? I got to drop off some artwork at DC. Would you like to share a cab? Yeah. And I was like, sure. Like, I had nothing to do, Oren. I had nothing to do. I'm in New York City with no purpose. And so I go with him. He gets me into DC. The first guy I talked to is Robert Greenberger, or Bob Greenberger. I show him my portfolio, and he's going, amazing, amazing. And then he goes, what do you want to do here? And I said, I don't know, draw comics. He goes, well, what book? Do you have any idea? I go, no. I'll take whatever you got. And so he goes, okay, well, we'll start you off with, like, remember, like, DC had Who's Who books, like they had the Who's Who of the DC universe, and they also did one for Star Trek. Yep. And so he was putting a Star Trek one together. And so he gave me a couple entries in that. And he said, if you can get this done by this time, he goes, we'll do something else, and so on and so forth. And so I had no paper, I had no drawing tools, I had nothing. So, and this was pre-phone, pre-internet. So I'm walking around New York City looking for, art supplies, And so I found some paper, I found, some drawing equipment, and went back to Craig's apartment and just drew my ass off. There was no drawing board or anything. So I'm sitting on the floor using this coffee table, and just kind of hunched over the coffee table, sitting on my butt. And I did it. I did 3 entries. I brought it in early. But just to back up, when I got home after getting that Who's Who work, the Star Trek stuff, Craig came home from his day. And this is the same day I got rejected from Marvel. This is all the same day. And he said, I was talking to Ralph. We do these Starline books. They're like kids' books. And so, like Heathcliff and, these different books. And then he goes, we got, it was The Inhumanoids. So it was a cartoon show at a toy line. And so they were doing a comic book. And so Jose Delbo was the penciler. RIP, he just passed. Yeah. And I was to ink him. So I got pencil work from DC, and I got ink work from Marvel on the same day. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it was like the worst day. It started off as the worst day of my life, right? And then it turned into one of the best days of my life. So, I stayed at Marvel. I stayed in New York as long as Craig would have me, because I felt like I needed to establish myself. And so I was making money and trying to, give Craig whatever I could, for his hospitality. And I ended up passing all the auditions. And so then I had a foot firmly planted at Marvel and in DC, because I knew I had to go back to California. I couldn't stay there, right? So at the time, it was kind of New York or New York adjacent artists, because I guess they figured they could trust them more. Right. Because they were close and they could drive the work in and take a train or whatever. And so they trusted me enough that I could, mail stuff in. And at the time that I was working, there was no Federal Express, there was no internet, there was none of that. So I had to go to the post office. I had to box everything up by their specifications. I had to put the brown paper on it and everything, all that crap, right? And that's how I did it. And then I would get reimbursed for my post cost from DC or Marvel or whoever. So that's pretty much how it all began. So you asked about inking, penciling, and I forget which one I like more, or what was the question again?
Or why did inking sort of become, you know, what you did the most in your career?
Okay, it's just practicality.
Gotcha.
Because I was mostly penciling the early part of my career. So really the only ink work I had done was that Jose Delbo stuff.
Right.
So DC kept me pretty busy. So I started working on the monthly title, The Warlord, the Mike Grill stuff. So I was doing that, and then I was doing some fill-in books on the Teen Titans Spotlight. Teen Titans was hot at the time. It was George and Marv Wolfman. And so I did some of that, and then I got offered I guess they call them maxi series back then. It was called Time Masters.
Yep.
So I was penciling that as well. So what was becoming very apparent is it was getting harder and harder for me to kind of distance myself from the work, because the story, the character, all that stuff, I really put my heart and soul into it. So I was slowing down because I was investing too much, of myself into the work. And so I finished up Time Masters just about the time the Superman Adventures of Superman job came in. And so they knew I was pretty good friends, tight with Dick Giordano. And so Dick knew I could do both these things, ink and pencil. So they needed a finisher over Dan Jurgens. So they figured my skill set would be pretty good for that. And so I kind of just went into doing finishes from that pencil job. And then I think I did worked on Superman for a couple years, up till the death of.
I want to talk about.
But let me okay, I'll put the exclamation. I'm sorry. The reason I took one over the other is because I was faster at it. So I could ink 2 pages a day. I could pencil 1 page a day, which was a struggle, right? So I could almost double my income and not kill myself. So that was the main thing. I just needed money.
Yeah, it's a good motivator. I want to ask about some specific things that you worked on, but a couple of general questions. And the first one would be, are there certain projects you look at as sort of evolutionary points in your career for you where you learn different things or your style changed a bit, that you could say, okay, I started like this, but in this book, I started doing this, and that led me to here and here and here?
That's a great question. Yeah, I guess so. I've never really thought about it. I'm pretty much like one of these guys that I just kind of do. I don't necessarily analyze stuff. So I think, and I wasn't conscious of it at the time, but people told me that the Dan Jurgens stuff, The Adventures of Superman, was kind of a pivotal move, because there was a style that was created for that book. And like I said, I wasn't real conscious of it. I had 2 things going on. I had Howard Chaykin, who I became friends with and hung out in his studio. And when I got the finish job, I said, "What are finishes?" I didn't even really know what they were. And so he said, basically, like hatching, shadows, whatever it is, like finish it. And he goes, whatever you want to do, you can do. So the end results are you. And so I was like, okay, that sounds cool. And then I had met Klaus Janson, and this wasn't all at the same time, but this was earlier. And I asked him, I said, how do you get to the point that you get to ink that way? I said, because, he was definitely not Marvel style. He was inking to his own music, like marching to his own, music. And he he was doing things way outside the box,
Mhm.
and I always liked that. And so he said just do little bits at a time. I said, what do you mean? He said, just change things over a course of like panels, issues, and stuff. And he said, before you know it, you'll be dictating the look of the book. You'll be doing what you want. And that required like some overview. Like that's more effort than, but it always struck me as like, oh shit, you could kind of slide, like this style instead of like asking permission to do it and that all that clumsy stuff, just kind of do it and then like evolve into something, and maybe have an idea of where you're going to go. But at the time I really didn't, but I just kind of liked that idea. And so both of these were very like freedom oriented. They were like, you can do what you want to do, right? And so as a creative person, I was like, this is great. So I was bringing all kinds of influences in on that Dan Jurgens adventures stuff, even like manga, like the Akira lines, like all those action lines and stuff. If you look, there was like these stylized like lines, so they weren't like the traditional like brush, like impact lines or things like that. So they were kind of more stylized. And so then there was this bloop, and then there was like these lines that went thick, thin, thick, and there was like these dashes, and there was these things that I was doing that were kind of stylized. Like I said, not overly aware of what I was doing or where I was going with it, but people seemed to respond, and I was so far out of it. Like I think that first year I was working on that book, I got nominated for like 2 or 3 different inker awards. I had no idea. Like Mike Carlin, my editor, told me. And I didn't win any of them, but I was nominated, and like my first big job, getting nominated, it's pretty. That was pretty killer, pretty cool. Yeah. So yeah, I think like Adventures was definitely one of those books. Um, I think when I inked Carlos Pacheco, I knew what he wanted. He wanted kind of like he's an Alan Davis guy, and he wanted kind of a Paul Neary, another RIP guy. And that's kind of more soft and brush. And I didn't want that. Like the X Office, this was on X-Men, was more about style, and I had already worked with Jim Lee and Will Portacio. And so I felt like I wanted to ink him in a different way. And that was very conscious. So it was a lot more stylized and than the way he was penciling. And then just to back up, I mean, there was the X-Men stuff with Jim and Wills. And that was kind of, but it was kind of a continuation of like the Adventures of Superman, that I came into. So I was kind of still inking similarly. And so that was influencing the group, and then they were influencing me. So there was kind of that West Coast style that was kind of evolving at that time. So this is early when Jim was doing Uncanny, and I think Wills was still doing Punisher or something like that. And so then Wills kind of came in and started on was it X Factor?
Yeah.
X Factor, and Jim was doing Uncanny. And so Scott Williams and I would just bounce back and forth between the two pencilers. And so there was that. So, and then I would say that was it. Just to be completely honest, after I worked with Carlos, this is after Image Comics, going back to Marvel. He liked what I was doing. Marvel liked what I was doing, but Carlos Pacheco, RIP. Oh my gosh, I just realized he's gone too. Holy shit, this is getting depressing. And so he wanted that Paul Neary look. He wanted that more brushed kind of traditional style. And so we kind of agreed to go different ways. But it broke my heart because I felt like I was killing it on that. Like there were people coming to me, and like Carlos never looked like this before. Like, what are you doing? Like, is he penciling like this? Whatever. And Rob Liefeld was like, he said this. He goes, I know not a lot of people really seem to get what you were doing, but I did, and you were kicking ass. You were killing it. So, but what happened is like I was going above and beyond, and I think when I got asked to leave, it hurt. It hurt me. So after that, I was kind of like, maybe I'm too heart and soul. Maybe I'm trying too hard. Maybe I should just kind of ink what's there and not try to elevate stuff. And so, for years after that, not that I was phoning it in. I mean, I was still, giving it my all, but I wasn't inspiring. I wasn't like trying new things. I wasn't giving ideas away, because that's how I felt. Like I felt like I was giving ideas away, like ink styles, techniques, things like that. And then a penciler could just emulate, like let's just say they didn't do the look wasn't the way until I inked them. And so then they started looking different. But most people that are buying the book, they don't understand, they don't know who's doing what, right? And so then if you leave the book, they can start penciling in that ink style, right? And then they can kind of claim it as their own. And so that was starting to happen. And I just kind of felt like I was doing this, and now I have no ownership of it anymore. You have ownership of it. So it was kind of a strange thing that was happening. And I really it was like a realization, like, well, maybe I shouldn't.
Sure.
I shouldn't do this anymore, kind of thing. And so it was kind of like an eye-opening thing. And then, but just kind of smash cut to just before I left DC, I was working on Action Comics with Steven Segovia. And so I asked for a raise, and they said, if you do X, Y, Z, they wanted me to go digital. So they wanted me to start scanning things and working off blue lines and stuff like that, which I didn't want to do. And I didn't up to that point. And so I said, well, what would that entail as far as a raise? And so they told me, and I was like, no. And they were like, no. And I said, I need more. And so then they said, well, this is what it would be. And I said, listen, I said, I've been holding back. Right. I said, I could ink things that would light your world on fire. I have ideas. I have things that I could do that would be inspired. I said, and I did. I had ideas, and I said, but I don't get paid to do that. So I was kind of more the mercenary, more the merc going in at that point, and just kind of being matter of fact about it and being confident, like I could do something, I could elevate this stuff. They did. They gave to DC's credit, they gave me the raise, and I worked with Steven, and I worked with Victor Bogdanovich, I think it was his name, on a Batman project. And so these guys were digital, and they were doing kind of tonal stuff. And they were like, well, don't worry about this tone stuff. We'll come back on. I go, no, I'll do it. I go, well, how could you do it? And I did. I emulated what they were doing with the computer digitally. I did it all practically. Gotcha. And if you look at some of that Steven Segovia stuff, and even that Victor Bogdanovich, there's grease pencil, there's some like fingerprint techniques. There's all kinds of stuff that I was doing. And it was like I delivered on my promise with DC, and I gave them stuff that was outside the box. And so that, I hope that answered the question. I mean, it kind of came and went. I've been doing this for 40 years, so there's stuff that you kind of. I remember talking to Dick Giordano, and he said, son, there are jobs you do for love, and there are jobs you do for money. And so what he was trying to tell me is like I was. And this is when I was young. This is when I was having problems penciling. He was saying, kind of just take the paycheck, get it done, and take the paycheck. And so you know, that's kind of what I did over time. So
So one of the things that I admire most about you, and you just mentioned some of the names that you work with. Like you started, with early with Mike Grell, who has a very distinctive look. Dan Jurgens, Portasio, Liefeld. When you are working with people like that, whose looks are so distinctive, what's the line of communication between you and them to make sure everybody's on the same page on that project? Or is it sort of you do your thing and they do their thing?
yeah, I never, like I said, I'm kind of like this fly by the seat of my pants. I don't like preconceived notions. I don't kind of, because it takes the fun away. I like getting pencils and just seeing it and then just kind of taking inspiration from what I see, right? So just kind of like, oh, well, maybe I could do this, maybe I could do that, so then you can just kind of riff up off of it. So early on in my career, pencilers weren't as fussy and controlling as they are now. So there was more, the inker got to do more and they trusted you more. So you were an assembler, you were a finisher, you were these things. So the penciler was more like storytelling, drawing the proportion, all that stuff. Inker was like the finish look, hatching, all that stuff.
Mhm.
And so early on, there was never like pencilers going, do it this way or do it that way. After like Image and stuff like that, pencilers started penciling tighter, and they started like trying to dictate the finished look. So they would pencil almost the same way as the inker would ink. So these weren't just like sketch lines; these were like finished, polished, yeah, like thin to thick, like all that stuff was all worked out. And so, but still, like I didn't. It's all gonna sound really bad. I don't like talking to those guys. I don't like talking uh, to pencilers. I don't take that stuff well. I don't like preconceived notions. I like just getting it and just ripping off it. And I would much rather be fired off a book for doing what I thought was the right thing to do versus taking instruction from somebody. I never really liked it. It took the fun out of it for me, and I like, sometimes magic happens, right? Sometimes like you don't have those preconceived notions, like because if you do, you go, well, this guy inked him this way, this guy inked him this way. I never looked at that. I didn't care, right? I knew about it, but I didn't really go, oh, this is, what he wants, or listen to what he wants. I just did what I wanted,
Right.
you know. And so a lot of times those experiments worked and they paid off.
Mhm.
And I think that's why you got exciting comic books, because it wasn't kind of preconceived. It wasn't like that. And just since I'm being completely honest, I worked with Victor Bondanovich, I think. And I just say that guy's a prima donna, right?
Mhm.
And so he drew like Greg Capullo,
Okay.
okay, and I think he still does. And I'm friends with Greg. I inked Greg, so I'm familiar with that look. But I'm kind of like, Greg Capullo exists. Why would I ink it like Greg inks his work, or like Danny Mickey inks his work, right? Like, why would I do that? I know that's what he wants. I know that's what he wants. And like, he would love, like, the closer I could get to Greg Capullo's finished look, it would make him happy. But I'm thinking, there's no reward in that. You know what I mean? Because people just look at it and go, oh, this is a Greg Capullo clone. So I was like, I'm going to try different techniques. I'm going to try, to make it not necessarily look just like that.
Mhm.
And so I thought it looked great. I really did. But he hated it. And so, eventually he got me Ken. But, it was one of those things. I did it. He tried to instruct me. I kind of didn't listen. And I still did my own thing. And I do think when you look at it, it's different than anybody else inked them. You know what I mean? It stands on its own, and it's a unique, one of a kind of approach. Right or wrong,
Right.
it is what it is.
I mean, I just want to say to your defense is you have a track record. I mean, when we talk about some of the names you work with, I would think there had to be a level of trust that you, of all people, know what you're doing. Because the books you've worked on have been successful books. They're books people are still talking about to these days, some iconic stuff. Is there a sense of frustration when, like, you have these ideas, you know what can work, and you're kind of getting that pushback?
Yeah, like I said, the Carlos Pacheco, and I no ill will there. I mean,
Right.
and he stuck with me for a long time. But that Victor, he was a pain.
Right.
He actually would get frustrated, tell me this, that, the other thing. He talked to the editor. The editor would come back and say these things, and so I was definitely, I knew that my time was numbered there, and eventually that he was going to get frustrated. But it was his first job.
Yeah.
He wasn't even like it was his first professional work. So I also thought, not to be arrogant, but I also thought this is great work. We'll just write out the contract. We'll get done, and then you can go your own way and I'll go mine. We don't have to like get crazy about it right this very minute, because that's what I look at too. It's like, just write out the series. If it's 8 issues, we'll do the 8 issues, or if you got hired to do 3 issues, we'll just do the 3 issues and then we'll move on. No harm, no foul. But he made it really difficult, and so that, and I thought he was pretty arrogant, like just the way he talked to me and stuff. So anyway, Victor, if you're listening, I don't know what to say to you. I don't know. I don't know.
I want to jump back a bit because your work on the X books, that sort of became ground zero for the boom of comics from that area. What were those early days like as a young man there? And you start to see momentum building. Jim Lee comes on, you have Liefeld, you have Wills, you have yourself. All these books, the fans can't get enough of them. I mean, it's becoming an event each time these books come out. As a young person, how are you handling all of this, almost attention going on?
Well, when I started in the X office, there was success. The X books were
Right.
still somewhat successful, but they weren't juggernauts. They weren't huge. So when I was working with Jim on Uncanny, it wasn't the crazy numbers.
Right.
You know what I mean? They were good, but they weren't the crazy numbers.
Mhm.
And so at the time, it just felt like another job.
Gotcha.
Just going in and doing another job. And people say, "Oh, well, Jim Lee." I was like, Jim Lee wasn't Jim Lee then. Like I knew Jim during when he was working on Alpha Flight. You know what I mean? Like you know what I mean? He's just another guy working on a book, right? And so you make your deadlines, you kind of move on, and also like royalties and that stuff. I think at the time it was 6 months.
Okay.
So you didn't know what the book sold, and you didn't know what the royalties, or Marvel called them incentives, until 6 months later. So while you're working on it, you kind of don't know, unless you're really in the loop, and you're following the numbers and you're doing all that stuff, which I never did. I was just more about the work, get the work done, try to do the best job you can. And so then there was the idea, and then I think, yeah, then X Factor started. So then Jim was now the full-time guy on Uncanny, and then Wills came in and did X Factor. So then there was like kind of a blue and gold team. I don't know what they called them, but there were like kind of like there were these two teams, and they didn't necessarily cross over, but you could tell they shared the same universe and all that kind of stuff. And there was some like similarities just in style, you know, with Wilson, Jim, and then Scott and myself, and we all kind of were developing and working in this direction that would become like the West Coast look, which is what they were calling it later. And so then, but you don't really know what's happening at the time. I think Jim knew a little bit because he did follow the numbers. He was kind of in the know a little bit more. But then, yeah, I remember going out with my girlfriend, who's my wife now, and I grabbed my mail. We were going out to dinner, and I just had it. I was going to open it during dinner, and there was a check from Marvel, and I opened it, and it was a royalty check for one of the X books, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" And I showed it to her, and she goes, "Are these numbers real?" And I go, "I think so." And so the next day I called Jim, and Jim's like, "I was trying to tell you, man, like this is worth it. You're wild, man." So um, the numbers are good, the money's good, so we're gonna kill ourselves on these books, and we're gonna, and the idea was like the four of us were going to stay tight. Like those two books were our books. Like there wasn't going to be any fill-ins, there wasn't going to be any of those things, right? So usually I was faster than Scott. So if Scott got into a bind like on, Uncanny, then Jim would send the page over to me. It very rarely went the other way. So there was kind of like we just stayed a tight unit and put those two books out, and then of course Jim did X-Men #1 that came out later, and then Wilson and I went on to Uncanny. So, and then I think Jim and Scott did 5 issues or 6 issues of X-Men, and then I came over and started inking Jim on that. And the reason that happened is because I was already doing finishes on Wills. Once again, pencils, inks, right? So Wills was kind of getting behind schedule, so they knew I could pencil. So then I was basic all that look, all the hatching stuff. I was penciling that stuff, and then inking it. And then when I came in on X-Men with Jim, it was the same thing. He was doing breakdowns, which is just kind of outlines for people at home. It's just kind of like a coloring book, like looking thing. And then like all that hatching and all the spot blacks and those things, those were done by me. So we worked that way to try to once again keep those books in-house. Like we didn't want to, and sometimes we still had to give up pages, but we never wanted to do that because we wanted to keep it the 4 of us. And then Image happened, and so we ended up leaving the X books to go to Image.
I want to talk Image in a second, but I'm just curious with X-Men, with success, does that bring more cooks in the kitchen as to what you guys are doing?
No, Bob Harris was really good. He understood, because some editors, and I think now today, like you would get like all the cooks, like everybody would want to come in there and claim it was their success, their vision, and everything. But Bob was very hands off, and he let us do our thing. But he supported us. He made sure that the deadlines were done. Anything we needed, he made sure we had, so that we could fulfill those books. We get them done on time, things like that. So he was more of just kind of a facilitator, making sure that things were done, making sure that we had what we needed, stuff like that, versus like telling us what to do. You know what I mean? He wasn't like that. So strangely, like I said, today you would think like it would be so heavy-handed. Everybody would be going, "Oh, do this, do that," try to take credit for the reason it was working or not. But there was none of that. So like I said, to Bob's credit, he kind of just let us do what we were going to do. Yeah.
because you came from DC and you go to Marvel, which are two well-structured, professional organizations, and you moved to a startup, which was Image. Was there structure there when you got there that to get things out on time, that it was working like as well at Oil Machine as maybe it was at Marvel and DC?
At Image?
Mhm.
Oh, no way.
Was that tough for you though? Because you're used to doing it a certain way, and then there's sort of a lot looser structure.
I knew all those guys. Like, Rob and I came up the ranks together, Liefeld, and I mean, we knew each other before we started working professionally.
Mhm.
So he would hang out in my apartment, and we would draw, comics together. When he was working on Hawk and Dove, I was there, and he even asked me to ink some of the faces, while we were just kind of riffing back and forth. So it didn't feel like things were out of control or unstructured.
Mhm.
It just felt like we were just making things up as it was going. So if this needed to be done, that's what we did. If this thing had to happen, then that's what we did. And that's kind of the way the X office was. Like I said, like if there was a deadline or there was a problem, the four of us worked it out. We very rarely would go, oh, Bob, for the answers. We just came up with them. Like when the book was really late and the pages had to be there the next day, but I needed all night to work on them.
Mhm.
I drove to the airport to LAX and dropped the box off 3 o'clock in the morning, Delta Dash, and then it would get to New York City the next morning. And then, to Bob's credit again, he was the facilitator. He made sure that bill was paid. It was $100 to ship that 1 page or 2 pages, right? But Marvel's making millions, so all that stuff was taken care of. But we were kind of used to like figuring stuff out, like, well, how can we get this done? Wills would come drive to my studio, we would work all night, or like whatever it was, like we worked it out between the four of us. So there was kind of already this, and I didn't even realize it until we're just talking. Like I didn't realize how kind of independent we were.
Mhm.
So like Image kind of felt, for me, it just felt like a continuation
Gotcha.
of the same thing. And there was chaos, but most of the chaos, because I worked at Extreme,
Mhm.
I got offers from Jim Lee to go to Homage Studios, which became Wildstorm. But I had just bought a house in Orange County. They were in San Diego. It would have been quite a commute. Extreme Studios was close to my house. And even before that, I used to live in the South Bay where Mark Silvestri lived. I lived in like what was it, Hermosa Beach. He lived in Malibu, so it was right up PCH. So we were practically neighbors. So in the early days, I was supposed to ink Cyber Force, and I was supposed to ink Wetworks. Those are my two books. So I was kind of being wooed by these three studios, and how it all worked out was just proximity. It was just practicality. So I ended up working out of Extreme Studios, and it was probably a good thing because I think one issue of Cyberforce came out that first year, and then Will's, because of tragedy, he wasn't able to put out Wetworks.
Right.
So it was kind of a good thing that I went over to Extreme, because I got work and I was able to, continue, getting paid.
Was going to Image sort of a must do, or is there any world where you would have stayed at Marvel? Did you just think that Image, this is the best place for me to continue my career?
It was kind of, like I said, like I never really thought too much about this stuff, Oren. So thanks for asking me the question. Everything just felt like a continuation.
Mhm.
It just felt like the logical next thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? It didn't feel like it was wrong.
Mhm.
It didn't feel like we couldn't do it. it just felt like a continuation. And to be honest, I never really was too hung up on like, well, if I do this, Marvel will never work for me again,
Right.
or I will never get to work at Marvel again, I should say. Because also I had no idea that Image was going to be the juggernaut. You know what I mean? So I thought at best it would be, maybe a lateral move, maybe a little less, but we'd be able to do our own thing, be our own bosses, and then ride that out as far as you could go, and then go back to Marvel or DC, But what happened was there was big animosity that happened because there was huge success at Image Comics. So it was harder. It would have been harder to go back to Marvel. But initially, I didn't think that way. I didn't know that was going to happen. So I wasn't really afraid. I wasn't really like, oh, this isn't going to work out. And also, these are the best artists in the business. We were all the best, top of our game. And if it worked at Marvel, then it would work here. And also, I remember having a conversation with Jim Lee. This is kind of before Image. It was kind of when it was starting to formulate the ideas. And I was talking to him, and I said, oh, it would kind of like be like Pacific Comics, back to Pacific. And Pacific was all like top talent doing creator-owned properties. And he said, kind of. And I said, what do you mean? This is exactly. He said, no. He said, because those guys, they were kind of on the downside of their career. They weren't at the pinnacle. He said, we are. And I was like, oh shit. You know what I mean? Like this is something. You know what I mean? Like this hasn't really been done before. And this is probably gonna hurt, Marvel. And I mean, because it wasn't just the artist, it was Todd McFarlane, it was the Spider-Man guys, it was Eric Larson, it was everybody. It was all the top tier. And also what people don't really think about, but there was also just all the supporting guys.
Right.
There was talent like myself, but then there's colorists, there's letterers, there's, you know what I mean? Like there were other talent that came over as well.
Yeah. When do you get the urge, or not the urge, I should say, the inkling of creator-owned stuff to say, you know what, let me try?
Well, once again, it kind of wasn't, I didn't think it, I didn't go, well, I would love to do something of my own. Right. I was just working at Extreme, and I was doing whatever Rob or the editors asked me to do. I didn't really have it. Like I said, I usually don't have a master plan. I just kind of go with the flow. And somehow I'm always able to be at the places that end up. If you look at my career, like almost every major thing that has happened in those 40 years, I've been part of it. And so he was just kind of like, you look bored, you should do something. And I was like, why? He goes, you pencil very, like, you should do your own book. He said, we'll publish it. You just come up with an idea and we'll publish it. And I was like, really? And he was like, yeah. And so I think she was still my girlfriend, who became my wife. We went to a Bruce Lee auction, estate auction, and it was his wife, Linda, and their daughter, and Brandon had just passed. Wow. So they were auctioning off of Bruce Lee's stuff. I mean, real personal stuff. I mean, this was an estate auction. And so I'm a big fan of the Green Hornet, grew up in the 60s, so Bruce Lee, Kato was my guy. So I had the order catalog, and there were like some of his throwing darts, the little Hornets. And I was like, I got to get one of those. I got to have one of those things. And so I think it was like $800 or $900 in the book. I'd never really been to an auction, so I didn't know what to expect. So I went there, and I put my paddle up, And before I knew it, it had blown right past my bid, right? Like I mean, it had doubled, tripled, quadrupled. And I just took the paddle down. And then my wife said, if you want it, you can, we'll get it. And I said, nah. And so then on the way home, because we lived in Orange County, we drove to LA for this. So it's quite a little drive. And so I just told her about Rob and this offer. And so Black and White was formed in that drive back. So the initial DNA for Black and White is the Green Hornet and Kato. So if you think about them, the prototypes, it's kind of there, non-lethal, pistols, martial artist kind of thing, and that dynamic. And so basically, yeah, Black and White was created at the name, the tagline, in a world where law and order is often blurred to gray, justice can only be black and white. All that stuff was all in that drive. And so then the next day I went into the office Extreme and I told Rob, I said, Black and White. He goes, I like it, just like the Jackson song. He goes, do it. He goes, just like the Jackson song. He goes, do it. And so, yeah, we did the 3-issue miniseries, and he was very generous. And so we did like a backup feature in all the Extreme. So there was like 2-page backup feature to introduce Black and White to Image Comics. And so that was kind of a segue into the miniseries. And the rest, as they say, is Black and White history.
Well, I mean, it has to take a bit of bravery to put your ideas out there, because Image was so hot, and so there's going to be a big audience for it. Is there any nervousness on your part as soon as the first thing goes out, or are you confident in what you've done because you've been in the business that, okay, I know what I'm doing, I'm confident with this going out there?
I'm never confident per se. I think I'm just stupid. like I'm just what I mean is, like, I don't think about that stuff. Like, like, this is the guy that just got on a plane and took off to New York City, like, that's still kind of how I am. So I don't really analyze things, and I don't think that deeply.
Right.
And I usually don't think about ramifications or like what would happen if this. I'm sure I do on some level,
right.
but I'm not one of those guys that overly dwells on that. So it always just kind of felt like, yeah, this is the thing to do. You know what I mean? Like, I'm around other people that are creating IP. These are my peers. Wetworks, Wildcats, Cyberforce, Youngblood, all these, Spawn, all these books. So why not?
Right.
So it just kind of felt, once again, just like, this is the thing to do.
You see, and I think that answers sort of my next question, because I sort of look at your resume and the books you've worked on. It's kind of like a big game hunter. Like, you've taken on Superman, you've taken on the X books, Image, back to the X books again, Fantastic Four. These aren't little characters. These are, characters that are sort of the pillars of these organizations. And you did them all so well. And, like you were just saying, I can imagine you being nervous getting Superman for the first time, or getting an X book for the first time, just you looking at it as sort of, okay, let's get this done because this is my job.
I always looked at things kind of temporary as well. Like when Mike Carlin called me for the Superman job,
Right.
I told him, let me think about it. Can I call you back tomorrow?
Right.
And he was kind of like, what? And I said, yeah, I just need some time to think about it. He goes, I said Superman.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, well, it was just it was a job. You know what I mean? Like, to me, it wasn't like, oh my gosh, it's Superman. Right. So I never really got to like hung up or geeking out on stuff like that. So I was never really nervous about it, because I also thought about it as it was temporary. Right. Like I still felt like, well, it could be taken away from me tomorrow. Right. Or I'll look for the next job in illustration or doing novel covers or like album covers or whatever it was. So it was always kind of like the hustle, right?
Right.
So it never felt that permanent, especially in the early days. After a while, you just stop and go, well, I guess I'm a comic book artist, but it wasn't like I really kind of aspired to be that.
Right.
It's just kind of like it was just a natural progression.
I want to be mindful of your time, and I'd love to have you back on to do more of a deep
This
dive.
sounds horrible because there's people that are like, "This is all I ever wanted to do." Like
And
they're just like, "Oh my gosh, if I didn't do this, I would have killed myself." That kind of thing. And I'm like, "Oops, I slipped on a banana peel there."
the luckiest guy in the world fell right in the clover.
So
But
don't hate me, anybody.
no, it's impossible to. But one more question, and that is, if someone came to you and said, asked what you do for a living, what is Art at his best? What's one project or one thing that you've worked on that you would show them to say, this is what I do for a living?
I would say what I'm working on right now, which is Black and White Man versus Machine Volume 2. So I'm crowdfunding now. So through Indiegogo, I have that campaign. And I think we just hit like 139,000, something like that on the campaign.
Mhm.
So we're going to be closing it out this Monday.
Mhm.
So time is very limited. I don't know when you're going to air this thing, but you know what I mean? So oh shoot, where am I at? You just disappeared. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
It's weird because if I leave the site, all this stuff goes away. So I can't go to another tab. Uh, so yeah, we're like 139,500 and something.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping we'll round it up to about 140 when it's all said and done. And like I said, we're going to be closing it this coming Monday, and we're almost done with fulfillment. So the books are going out right now. So everybody that's backed the books, they should be getting. If you haven't got your books, you should be getting them very, very soon. So yeah, it's near and dear to my heart. These creator-owned things it's definitely more personal. It's something. Black and white and these creator-owned these ideas. For me, when I went from Image back to Marvel, black and white never left my soul. So at night, I still drew and I still wrote stories for these characters after I put my 8 or 9 hours in at Marvel. So I did that for like 10 years or so.
Mhm.
Nothing's ever really came out of it, but it was kind of developmental stuff. It was all necessary to get to the place I am now. And maybe at some point I'll publish that stuff as just kind of black and white notes or
Right.
sketches, something like that. But it never left my soul. So now I do. I was able to be the right place at the right time almost my whole career. I think right now, independent, freedom, and crowdfunding is the place to be. So that's what I'm doing now. I wasn't pushed out of DC. I left consciously. I was working on Super Sons. It was a good selling book, but I just felt like this is the place I need to be. So I came in. I dabbled with crowdfunding before I left DC. So I did an art book, and I did a creator own. I did Chrono Mechanics.
Mhm.
I crowdfunded, and so then I was just, I'm going to do this full time. So I just kind of left because it was getting hard to juggle all the different, do the creator own stuff and do the DC stuff as well. And I'm getting older, so I thought I'll just put all my time into black and white and Chrono Mechanics and these type of creator own IP ideas.
Right. Now, is black and white right as it is right now, from where you started it, would you have changed anything from the very beginning? Or do you like the way you started it and you just continued from where you were to where it is today?
Um, I I don't really have a lot of should haves, would have, could haves. Like I don't I think that's one of the sadder things in life. Like if you look back and go, well, I didn't do this or I didn't do that, or I could have done this, I could have done that. I think everything was happened for the right reasons and it got me to this place. So I think it was sad that Image and the comics industry kind of the sales went down. Like in '94 is when Black and White first came out. And then I was going to do an ongoing Black and White. It's called Codename Black and White after that. So I inventoried 3 issues, took almost a year, inventoried 3 issues. So then once, the first one comes out, I can just boom, 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 on schedule. And so by the time we went to publish the ongoing, the industry had just kind of, the bottom fell out of it. So the sales were not supporting, these books like they were. The numbers were still good to today's, but also costs were high. So, your vendors were charging a lot, because it was Image Comics, there was a lot of money, and things like that. So I had to leave Image and go back to Marvel. Also, we had just had Amanda, our little daughter, and so I needed kind of something that was more stable. So Marvel once again was that. So steady paycheck, all that other stuff, and Image was a little too risky at that point. And I believe I made the right move because it fell apart pretty fast after that. And so it was kind of like a sinking ship. So Jeff Matsuda, Chap Yape, and Sam Liu, and a couple of the other Extreme guys, Chris Leitner, the colorist, they created Liquid coloring later. We kind of just left Extreme and started our own studio. And it was more like just to hang out. It wasn't, like any grand scheme or anything like that. I think it all kind of progressed in an organic way to get me to this point, because the characters that are in volume 1 and volume 2 are similar, but they live in a different world. They're slightly different. They're not the same characters. So this is kind of a reimagining of the Black and White universe. The characters are at their core are the same, but like their abilities, their powers, their suits, the world they live in, things like that are completely different.
Is that also part of you changing as a person over these years and you evolving as a creative person?
Perhaps. I think it for me, I think it was probably just getting your skill set down to where you could take something on like this and stay truer to the vision, because you have the chops or you have better chops. So I think like back in the 90s, the sales were up, but I wasn't the artist that I am now. Okay. So I don't think I would have been able to pull off the complexity of some of the storytelling, the character, all that stuff that are in the new versions. I think these characters are a lot more fleshed out. They're a lot more interesting. The world, like I said, it is world building. I think it's very coherent, and I just think I didn't quite have the skill set that I have now.
And we are back. Yeah, it sounds like this Kickstarter he's doing. It's already got all the pledges needed very quickly, because Art's a huge name. He's such a respected guy in the industry. His work is phenomenal. I actually have a poster behind me. You can't see it, it's off screen, that he did. I'm just a huge fan, and to talk to him, to get his insight on, all these projects he's been a part of that have been part of our comic book collecting was so wonderful. I think we really scratched, just the tip of the iceberg here. We'd love to have him back on to continue the conversation. So Art, thank you. Guys, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Remember to rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends, check out our shop on TeePublic, and we will see you Friday. Have a great day.